Welcome to Not Suitable for Democracy, the show about the problems facing American democracy and sometimes how to solve them through organizing. I'm your host, Nick, and on today's episode, we are going to discuss how James Talarico won the election in the Democratic primary for the United States Senate representing Texas. Now, we know that there was a very competitive primary between Rep. Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico, but as of 2:30 a.m., the Associated Press called the election in favor of James Talarico. Now, we're going to go through how he won, basically through his messaging, through his organizing, and his marketing. These three elements really put him over the top, and at the end of the day, this is how the voters of Texas decided who they want to represent them for the Democratic Party in the general election come November. Now, we have a lot to get through, so let's get to it. One more thing, if you like what you hear and want to learn more, then make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. So how did James Talarico pull off this amazing win? Well, there are three components that we're going to focus on for this campaign. Now, we know there are tons of factors that go into winning any election, but we're going to focus on the message, the organizing, and the marketing. Okay, so with that said, James Talarico wound up winning the U.S. Senate race to represent the state of Texas in the Democratic primary. Now, that is very important because the way the Democratic primary works in Texas is that voters had a choice to not necessarily be registered as a Democrat, but they can choose which party's primary they wanted to vote in. So because of that, I contrast that with what normally New York has to go through, where New York State have closed primaries, which means you must be registered as a Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary. But not in Texas. As long as you're a registered voter, you can choose which primary to vote in. But what we're finding, especially in the electorate today after 2024, is that independents, folks that aren't necessarily part of either party, they are actually growing in number where registered voters are not registering as a Republican or as a Democrat. James Talarico knew this, so his message had to be broad enough to welcome more people, Republican, Democrat, Independents, into his coalition, and that is key. The first part of that is what influenced and informed the message. James Talarico did not run as a partisan fighter like Jasmine Crockett did. Jasmine Crockett wanted to energize the base of the Democratic Party, which also kind of signals loyalty to the party, taking on the brand identity to the party, but also taking on the baggage from what the Democratic Party brand represents. James Talarico was clever. He did not do that with his message. He did not really focus on the party loyalty, but he focused on reforming the party from within, challenging the systems. The key component to what James Talarico shared across a lot of his campaign speeches, right, was that he wanted inclusion, not diversity, but inclusion. Now, it's not saying he eschewed diversity, right? But it's to say that he focused on inclusion because it allowed more people into his campaign to build a broader coalition. So the foundation of a good message comes from starting with the candidate. Now, of course, there are so many different ways to promote and market, yourself. But in an election, James Talarico knows that what people are looking for these days is authenticity. The Mayor Mamdani of New York City, he is the best example of authenticity, where he did not shy away from who he is with his Muslim faith, being a democratic socialist, being progressive on a range of issues, right? Zohran Mamdani led with that, and he left it on his sleeve, and people saw exactly who he is, and that resonated with people because they liked hearing, someone being truthful, and it sounded, they like someone being truthful about who they are and how he's going to deliver for them. And James Talarico did the same thing. James Talarico was a former public school teacher, middle school teacher, so he knows what it's like to be in the classroom. He also knows how to present and talk and communicate. Being that public school education, but more so that teaching is what really brought him into the fold on how to relay that message across all different types of people. If you can really encourage and inspire middle school students, then you have a really good chance on inspiring people all around the state. Now, on top of that, James Talarico is also practicing to become a seminary. He is not shy about being a devout Christian, but more importantly, he uses his faith to really frame the teachings of Jesus in a more, not in a political way, but in a way that cuts through the noise, especially when talking about political issues. James Talarico was notorious on the campaign trail for talking about his faith and how he believes a better future is possible. Now, with Christianity, we know one of the tenets is really loving thy neighbor. And James Talarico referenced that so many times when talking at town halls, campaign speeches, right? Talking one-on-one with voters. That idea that we should love thy neighbor really simmers down the partisan infighting and the political fighting amongst Republican and Democrat parties. So what James was able to do was lean on his faith, right? Campaigning authentically, but also framing the conversation in a way that supports how his faith will inform the policy that he will fight for to deliver for the people. That was the key argument that James Talarico made, and that is how he did so successfully in the Democratic primary. So if you recall a lot of James, what he was talking about was that it doesn't matter if the fight in the primary was not about left versus right, it's top versus bottom. And what I mean by that is that he flipped the script on how we would look at and frame the conversation. Something that AOC did back in 2018 in her primary was that she shared that same top versus bottom mentality, but more so it allows more buy-in for people who are starting to learn about your campaign. This is where James Talarico focused on the top, meaning the 1%, the oligarchy, the billionaires. This wealth inequality message is what resonated across not only race, gender, but even socioeconomic class. And he was able to cut through the identity politics of it all by really running on a populist message. Because we've seen from AOC's or Mamdani, Bernie Sanders, economic populism, especially coming through, let's say, the lens of a democratic socialist, right? That commitment to the fight of not only inclusion, saying that workers have a stake in our prosperity, but also that voters and working class Americans definitely have a stake in a dignified life. This is the same kind of messaging that was reflected in James Talarico's campaign, especially how he talked through all of his issues. So at the end of the day, James Talarico's message, while it did focus on policy, it focused on a way that was inclusive, not keeping the partisan fighting, welcoming more people into his campaign, and essentially running on a message of love and inclusion. This was also very important because the tone mattered. At a time when we know Trump and Republicans are creating partisan divisions, they're stoking fear, and people are getting very anxious about what's happening in the world. Well, James Talarico had a really good counter argument for that. Instead of fighting, he thought about bringing people together, being a unifier. He talked about love and inclusion after the shooting in Austin that happened. He talked about love and inclusion after the immigration raids that were happening across the country. He talked about love and inclusion, especially how we can love our neighbor, how we can love, the strangers we don't know. Very similar to the not me, us messaging that Bernie Sanders used in 2020. This is how we can actually build a coalition to bring people into the fold. More importantly, by talking about systems, he could then bring more people in to not make the fight about people, but about how we can make our systems work better for the people. This was a great strategy that really helped his messaging. And at the end of the day, voters were able to understand where he was coming from, not coming across as divisive, but coming across as a unifier. And now he'll be up for the challenge to unify the state of Texas to vote for him in a general election come November. So now we know that James Talarico started with a strong message, and then he could start with organizing. So James Talarico launched his campaign on September 9th, 2025, giving him from September through March to get the word out about his campaign. Now, having so much time allowed him so much to essentially run a campaign in order to, secure his victory on March 3rd. So what I mean by that is that he really did all of the steps brilliantly. So first, launching the campaign, the first thing any campaign needs is money. So because James Talarico's message was focused on rejecting corporate wealth, attacking the billionaires, right? He could then use that to then inform how he's going to raise money. By rejecting corporate PAC money and lobbyist money, he was able to then run more authentically by raising only grassroots donations. And boy, did he raise a lot of money. He raised over $20 million for this Democratic primary. Now, knowing that he was able to run with only grassroots dollars, that allowed him to really speak more freely about the issues, challenging powerful elites and challenging the systems that be. So because of that, he was able to then organize better. So first, he raised a lot of money in order to, fund his operations. 2, his message of inclusion made it a lot easier to talk to people on the ground. Now remember, in the Democratic primary in Texas, you don't have to be a voter of the Democratic Party. You just have to be a registered voter. And in Texas, there are over 18 million registered voters. So that's a lot of people to work with, right? So James Talarico, once he raised a lot of his money, right, he then had to work on getting his word out. How do you do that? Well, like any campaigner and volunteer knows, we know that you need to be on the ground talking to voters. So how did James Talarico do that? Well, James Talarico did a really good job with volunteer signups, getting his word out across all areas of the state. Now, Rep. Jasmine Crockett, you may hear that she was not on the ground in some of the rural parts of Texas, right? Her main focus were on the urban centers, aka the Democratic Party base. So while she was looking for voters in her organizing in the urban centers and the suburban areas around the big cities, James Talarico really went out to some of the most rural, obscure parts of Texas that usually don't get the same kind of attention during elections. Now, to be fair, Jasmine Crockett did visit some of the rural areas, but not as broadly as James Talarico. So in terms of organizing, you just got to show up. James Talarico, he was going to the local festivals, the local marches, the local events, ranging from celebrations in the Latino community to other more, let's say, I don't want to say establishment, but more established events put on by party leaders in the sense of like, he knows that there were going to be a huge swath of voters going to these politically minded events, and he was able to tap into those networks. So because James Talarico, his message was broader, he could tap into a series of networks to expand his reach. For instance, he talked to young voters, and he even got the endorsement of the Young College Democrats in Texas. So because of that, more of the young folks were able to sign on to his campaign, volunteer, and get the word out. James Talarico also is learning to be a seminary. So because James Talarico made his faith a part of his message, he was then able to use that as not only as a talking point, but also connect in the churches. Whether it was the white churches or the black churches, James Talarico was able to use his faith as a strong selling point. Now, even though we know Jasmine Crockett was winning with a huge majority of the black vote, we know that James Talarico was able to use his message of faith to bring some of them into his campaign or into his coalition. So putting it, thinking about all the steps of the campaign, he was able to raise money. He was able to have a broad message to talk to many different types of people. He was able to tap into different networks. And then lastly, for the organizing, he showed up. James Talarico also shared that on a campaign speech in Austin on February 17th, I believe he shared that there were over 22,000 volunteers who had signed up to participate in his campaign. 22,000 is a lot, especially for a statewide race. Granted, it would have been better if there were even more. For example, Zohran Mamdani had 50,000 volunteers in New York City for his Democratic primary. So, with the 22,000 that James Talarico had, he was able to scale in places all around the state. Now, there are other reports saying that James Talarico had 13,000 volunteers, but regardless, because I kept hearing more about the numbers of volunteers, this also signals to high information voters, people who like to volunteer and canvass, right? Those of us who appreciate the organizing, we kept hearing those signals from the campaign. So seeing how Talarico's campaign was committed to being on the ground, being present, and getting more people to grow his volunteer base, that gives a sense of enthusiasm, and that even leads to better organizing, because that could also be a talking point. Hey, you like James Talarico? Join the rest of us. There's our friends, neighbors signing up. Please join our campaign, and we can obviously bring this to victory. And James Talarico did just that. So between his organizing, right? But I do want to call out how he organized really with an inclusive message that resonated with the Latino population in the Rio Grande Valley. This is huge because we know that from 2024, Trump won the Latino vote, especially in Texas. Or at least I shouldn't say won it, but he did win a substantial portion of those voters. So now Democrats were tasked with having to bring them back into the fold. So James Talarico met them where they were at. He talked with the message of inclusion and love, and that resonated with a lot of people. So because he was able to then go to places like El Paso, Hidalgo County, right? These are all places where we know voters will show up, but also open to hearing his message. So from all of that, James Talarico did a really great job organizing on the ground, getting out there, but also doing really well in the urban centers such as Austin, his home base, where he represents the area. And then lastly, this is how he was able to bring enough people into his coalition to win. So now, last but not least, is the marketing. How did James Talarico market his campaign in a way that would cut through the noise, grab people's attentions, but really resonate with the message that would then convince people that he was the candidate, and then they had to get off the couch and vote? So, we know that James Talarico launched his campaign again September 9th, giving him a lot of time to organize and get the word out. So James Talarico opted for a more traditional structural way to get the campaign word out by using a lot of TV ads. We know that James Talarico even had a Super Bowl commercial that aired in many of the big Texas markets. So first, raising the money that allowed him to afford a Super Bowl ad, that was such a smart strategic move, seeing how this primary was March 3rd. Only a month before the Super Bowl, February 8th, James Talarico can really push his name recognition because we know that James Talarico didn't have a strong name ID compared to Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett has made a name for herself from having those viral video moments, clapping back to Marjorie Taylor Greene, obviously having a strong words for President Trump. So James Talarico had that uphill battle in terms of getting his name out about his message. But again, using TV ads, as much as it doesn't always work in maybe more local primaries, right? We know that this statewide race definitely needed to go big, and it absolutely paid off. Now, on top of the TV ads, we also know social media, name of the game in today's world. So how did James Talarico use social media to win his campaign? Well, now we know that both Jasmine Crockett and James Talarico had just over 2 million followers on their respective Instagram accounts. And that is very important because that shows a level of enthusiasm in the digital spaces, right? How are people engaging with their campaigns? Now, because of that, James Talarico created a separate account called Team Talarico HQ. Team Talarico, this Instagram account, was really, really clever in making sure that not only were videos of James Talarico, disseminated across the internet, with from his town halls, campaign events, and just him talking about like the issues, right? Getting these moments out there could expand his reach. So instead of having James Talarico having one account, they actually opted for two. But also seeing how James is a state house rep, especially in New York, yeah, usually you have like your campaign account and then your elected official account. And same with Jasmine Crockett, right? Usually you don't really campaign from both, you campaign from one. So having the Team Talarico account, that had over 200,000 followers on Instagram. So just another way to expand the reach for getting his name out. And that became very helpful, especially when they used a marketing tactic, which Zora Mamdani's campaign did as well. If you tag James Talarico on Instagram, right, using the Team Talarico, they will send an automated direct message talking about the campaign. By raising money and asking to volunteer, he was able to build a lot more quickly and scale his campaign that he needed for a statewide race. So the brilliance behind James Talarico's marketing really all converged from the Colbert interview moment. Now, we know that because President Trump's FCC, Brendan Carr, tried to give guidance to Colbert saying, hey, you need the equal time rule, meaning that if you're going to give James Talarico time, you need to give Jasmine Crockett equal time, but also the candidates in the Republican primary time on your show. So because Colbert's network did not air the interview, they shared the interview on YouTube. And because of this media moment, right, having Trump kind of pressure the media again to do something in his favor, this just reaffirmed the message that progressives like James Talarico are really in the fight. And it's not like James Talarico asked for this, right? This is something that Trump kind of brought into the moment, but then it backfired. Not only did James Talarico get more views on YouTube than expected on TV, but this gave a lot more people searching his name. Now that is critical, especially in the world of social media. Now with Google, we know there was a huge spike of people searching for James Talarico in the 24 hours that the Colbert interview was supposed to air. More people searching, more people coming to James Talarico's campaign website. Now this was so crucial, where James Talarico optimized his website for a mobile-first strategy. And this was where the genius came into play. Because of people coming to his website, James Talarico did this one small tiny thing that basically won him the election. What did he do? He actually added this tiny little banner that had early voting and election day voting at the top. Now, I know that sounds very small, and I'm not going to say that's the only reason he won. But that is a make or break moment that literally made the moment for James Talarico. When you visit his campaign website, right, you're going to see very black and white branding, very much like Beto O'Rourke's, but also very clear. And it stood out with the bold graphics with the white on black, but also having a mobile-first strategy allowed for a lot of scrolling, right, especially on a phone. So because of that, you'll notice that the black banner at the top followed you everywhere you searched on the website. Now, some people may say that's annoying, but if this little banner is telling people to early vote and vote on election day, that is what they need. Like, oh, I like what I see on this landing page. You know what? I like this guy. I can vote for him. Boom, it's right there on the screen. So voters saw instantly how they could support James Talarico. It is such a no-brainer, and I know it's such a little detail, but these are the things that matter. When you have people searching your website and you put on the banner, early voting polling location, right? This is huge. And especially in a statewide race, when younger voters, right? First-time voters, people who don't know, aren't used to the whole rigmarole of casting a ballot, right? They were able to quickly find their information, quickly check if they were registered to vote, and then they knew where to go to support James. Now, on Jasmine Crockett's side, she did not have the same mobile-first strategy. Now, on her campaign website, while she did have a more extensive policy platform, one big thing to note is how the policy platforms were presented. Jasmine Crockett, while it was very thorough, she had a lot of text, a lot of reading. Now, the good thing is that her text was user-friendly, where it didn't really go too deep into the weeds with details. And the reason why I find that as a good thing is because, most voters aren't going to read through all of it. Like a very small percentage of high information voters that are information voters are going to actually read it, like yours truly. But James Talarico knew that a mobile first strategy is what the electorate is meeting for this moment. So, for example, James Talarico's platform page was mostly video. There were images, the images on his policy platform that would then showcase what he was about. It had a little bit of copy to know what they were talking about, but then it was the video that really captured people's attention. And while he didn't have as many policy or issues as Jasmine Crockett's, it was enough to get the point across. It didn't muddy the waters. Sometimes the message gets too muddled when there's too many details and too many issues. He just focused on what was clearest. He focused on what resonated with his platform and his message. And essentially, he got the word across by just sticking to the main talking points. So at the end of the day, the compare and contrast, we knew that James Talarico had a better marketing strategy. And lastly, and the last thing I'll say about this, even though James Talarico wasn't the social media star like Jasmine Crockett, he didn't have the same influencer kind of strategy that Jasmine Crockett did. Jasmine Crockett had a lot of influencers, a lot of influencers of color talk about her campaign, trying to reach folks quickly and on a massive scale. Now, that did happen, and it was good that she employed that message, just like Zohran Mamdani did. He had a ton of influencers talking about his campaign, and he was going on different podcasts, different Instagram accounts, right? Zohran was everywhere in digital spaces as well as on the ground. Jasmine Crockett was talked about in a lot of digital spaces, but she was not necessarily on the ground as expansively as James Talarico. Now, James Talarico was talked about on key podcasts. He met people where they were at, when going on a variety of different internet shows, different podcasts, even Joe Rogan. So the fact that James Talarico were meeting people in all these different spaces online, this allowed him to get this message out for a very expansive reach and whatnot, but even on the ground. And that hybrid type of campaigning, right? On the ground and online, that is what could make or break the moment. And in this case, James Talarico is able to win the Democratic primary in Texas for the United States Senate. Congratulations one more time to James Talarico, State House Rep from Austin, for winning the Texas Democratic primary for the United States Senate. If you like what you heard on today's podcast, then I would love for you to subscribe so we can continue this journey, learning together, organizing, and winning elections, because now, for the 2026 midterms, we are about to see how James Talarico's message will resonate across primaries all across the country between now to the last Democratic primary in September. So join us for the journey. Make sure to subscribe to Not Suitable for Democracy on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. You can follow along for more news and content on Instagram and TikTok. I use the same handle for both, so make sure to follow along at NSFD_pod. I am just so proud of James Talarico and anyone who is volunteering and supporting and voting for his campaign. It truly means a lot that right now, the people on the ground across the state of Texas have declared a new victory is upon us, especially for the Democratic Party, because we need candidates who are going to fight the systems as well as the people in charge and the people in power, so we can take back what is ours, and that is a dignified life for the working class right here in America. And the only way to do that is to build and unify a big coalition that starts in Texas, but now we need to finish the job around the country. And remember, democracy is not suitable without you.